This is a real problem which needs to be addressed because it's something that annoys millions of people every day. Whereas, to be blunt, the kind of things that politicians tend to get preoccupied with are point-scoring exercises involved in, and of course we choose politicians. What are they? They're lawyers or they're lifetime politicos. They've done PP in Oxford, right? What do we optimize for in politicians? The ability to win arguments. And what they like is a really good argument. Now, the skill you need to solve problems and the skill you need to win arguments, they're not the same skill. Okay? I think our education system causes people to think they're the same. If you can win an argument, if you can write a really good essay arguing a particular case, then that means you're right. And I think this is hugely dangerous because I think problem solving is actually a messy evolutionary process where you explore what you might call the intermediate possible, and you're happy to look at, maybe you might consult 10 different mental toolkits in solving a problem, maybe more. Let's look at this from a psychological point of view. Let's look at this from a complex systems point of view. You have basically a fairly well-stocked mental toolkit. And to win an argument, you take one kind of axiomatic assumption. You construct a kind of rational... James O'Brien, I think, has become hugely guilty of this.
Yeah,
okay?
Left-wing radio
Jesuitical kind of... I have constructed an argument based on a fairly dodgy premise. And because I can therefore build 2 or 3 inductive or deductive steps that hold together, therefore I am right, and everybody else who disagrees with me must be in some way deranged.
That's for anyone who doesn't know. He's a British radio presenter.
By the way, he was one of my favourite radio presenters until I think he got caught in this, because you can be, to a degree, a non-combatant in the culture wars.
Yeah, I feel like it's just to some extent.
It's not a cop-out, okay? Just say, look, there are some well-intentioned people who are in danger of going mad on both sides. If I can remain well-intentioned without the lunacy, chalk it up as a win. Okay. I did have this conversation with John Cleese, which is, for example, trigger warnings aren't a crazy idea at all. Let's just take something which often drives the right absolutely insane. But then right-wing people would probably be very keen for their Netflix films to warn them in advance in case their children were exposed to, bad language or nudity or sexual content, whatever that may be, or indeed tobacco consumption, which now comes up as a trigger as well. But that's not a crazy idea, by the way. If you're a recovering heroin addict, suddenly you're confronted with a great needle scene.
The issues from a moderate angle with trigger warnings, I think. I just heard Ralph Fiennes, or Rafe as I believe he likes to go by. Rafe Fiennes, that's Voldemort for people who don't know, saying that he doesn't like a trigger warning, particularly in a theatre, because you're supposed to be shocked. You're supposed to be shocked by Shakespeare, by the deaths and the murders and all of these things. And if you go into it going, by the way, guys, you need to be warned about these things.
There's an easy solution to this. This is where I come down to solutions. There's an easy solution to that, which is you make the triggers optional. Okay, if you're not very triggered by things, okay, then you don't read the trigger warnings. But you simply have a button, which is if you... I can completely understand that someone who's been the victim of, say, domestic abuse or domestic violence,
of course,
doesn't want suddenly to be... I had a friend at college who came out of the film Betty Blue.
Oh.
I think in a state of extraordinary kind of distress. And it was something to do with a scene involving the human eye, because he'd been involved in an air rifle accident where someone's eye had got shot when he was quite young.
I see.
It was something of that kind. I can't remember the details. And actually, I don't think he's going to go and watch Le Chien d'Andalou at any point. But it is reasonable that people who have high sensitivities to things or past trauma... that's the most extraordinary case. Someone was telling me about this, which is that I think they were a Vietnamese, if I'm right, effectively... not so much a refugee, effectively. And they were rescued, I think, was it the Thai army or something, rescued them from their boat, okay? And the Thai army were absolutely lovely. They looked after all these kids. They were really nice. And what do you do if you're in the army? Well, in the evening, you watch war films. And this friend was actually a friend of my wife's, who was kind of Vietnamese refugee. Effectively, she remembers that, you'd take the kids in, plonk them in the sofa. As a real treat, you'd show them Rambo or something, right? Okay. Now, it is not unreasonable that people should have the option, and that's, by the way, a really important point. The option of doing things, okay, which make things easier for other people. Yeah, I kind of buy that theatrical point, which is there are people who want to be surprised, and therefore you shouldn't necessarily foist a trigger warning on them. But equally, we can solve that with an interactive button on the skybox or a little fold-over flap at the back of the theatre programme. Okay?
I think that's spot on. But I think a lot of people would like that. Well, that's why you're the most sensible person often on YouTube, because I think people would like that very much.
There's a point about this, which is there are two modes of thinking. There is effectively antagonistic thinking. There's adversarial thinking, which tends to assume trade-offs, either or, zero-sum game, okay? This is a problem. I'm now going to decide that I'm going to be on one side of this or the other, okay? But there's also integrative thinking, which is genuine creativity, where you look at two things which appear to be in opposition and then say, actually, they're not in opposition at all. We can actually reframe this so that they're actually two complementary parts of the same system, yin and yang. You see advertising do this all the time. Good things come to those who wait. What's the worst thing about Guinness? It's fucking slow, right? Mm-hmm. In fact, I don't know if you've ever been a barman, but apparently the worst thing you can do, one interesting thing with barmen is they don't like it if you hold out a £20 note to say, I haven't been served yet. We think we're doing them a favour because it's reminding them who has been served and who hasn't. And bar staff find it rude because they know who hasn't been served, and therefore they find it kind of insistent. So
I find it rude anyway. I think that I've always found that rude.
You've always thought that's a bit rude.
It's money in your face.
Well, yeah, it is a bit sort of, I suppose it's a little bit like the strip club, only for booze.
Yes.
It is grotesque. A lot of the people who do that, the folded up £20 note thing, were doing it as a favour, thinking they were doing a favour to the bar staff, just so the bar staff, it's a bit like the beep question. How you interpret the information has a huge effect on your emotional reaction. Your emotional reaction effectively determines your behaviour. And therefore, the same thing framed in two different ways can lead to two completely different behaviours. And there's this weird obsession, I think, with what you might call context-free absolute decision-making. This is true regardless of context, but the whole of human perception is context-dependent. Everything you do, and the book, by the way, you must interview this guy. It's called Andy Clark, and he's written a book called The Experience Machine, effectively about how human perceptual mechanisms work, how the brain processes information. And it looks as though if his theory, it's not his theory originally, 19th century people like von Helmholtz, I think, and I think William James also believed it, but that most of what we perceive as a prediction, and then our senses perform error correction. In other words, it's much more efficient as a data architecture to have your eyes saying you expected this, but actually it's slightly different. So I'll concentrate the incoming information on what is contrary to what you expected, rather than, for those of you into digital photography, what that suggests is our vision doesn't work in raw mode, where effectively every pixel is described in painstaking detail. It's JPEG. In other words, the way a JPEG works, the reason it's so efficient in terms of its use of data, is that there's a predictive value for each cell or each pixel based on either, in the case of film, preceding cells or adjacent cells, okay? And data is only used to the extent that the cell differs from the predicted value. And that means you can construct the same image with much less data by effectively using data. The incoming bandwidth is used in a kind of Bayesian way to correct for prediction error rather than to form the image de novo. Okay. Yeah. Now, if that's true, of course, which I think it probably is, because Samsung and Canon and everybody else seems to have come up with the same data architecture now, William James and von Helmholtz didn't have the advantage of consumer electronics to understand what they were talking about and why it was beneficial. But this idea that most of what we see is a prediction, and the reaction of to the information is highly coloured by the context in which we find ourselves. Okay, so dark street at night, sound of footsteps, highly attuned. Okay, Oxford Street, don't even notice the footsteps. Yeah. Okay. Now, this idea that if it really is that simple, okay, that humans react to information in a way that's context sensitive, okay, and that the context determines the emotional response and the attention and therefore the behaviour, then the idea of optimizing for objectivity is kind of stupid anyway. So what Guinness did is good things come to those who wait.
Yep.
It's a pain in the arse waiting for my Guinness to be poured. You turn the wait into a kind of, a benefit. Okay, you turn lead into gold. You effectively make a silk purse out of a sow's ear. Avis, we're number 2 in rent-a-cars, so we try harder. You turn their smaller size into a support point for superior customer service. Okay. Reassuringly expensive for Stella Artois. You turn a weakness into a strength.
Did you see that new Mercedes ad when the guy was retiring? It was like the guy who'd been the CEO of Mercedes for 50 years or whatever. He was retiring and he finally drives home. I don't know how real this is, but it's the ad. Finally drives home, gets into his garage, and he comes out in a BMW and it sort of goes, oh, finally, or something like that. And it comes up with something like, congratulations to BMW for 100 years or something. And for fantastic competition or something like that. And it makes it very clear that Mercedes has been going for 125 years. And it sort of makes BMW their little brother and is saying, extending a hand to them. Beautiful. But it was great.
Beautiful. Exactly this kind of thing. And you can actually play with perception and reframe things in a way that makes your thinking much more nuanced. First of all, because you acknowledge that different people are perceiving things in different ways. Okay.